Yes, it's now 16 days to go until the UK is due to leave the European Union. Yes, after another whopping defeat for Theresa May's divorce deal, we're wondering if it'll be deal or no deal Brexit, whether there will be a second referendum, a general election, whether Parliament has in its ranks a faction or a leader that can build some kind of majority for some kind of solution. And yes, on this side of the English Channel, we're also wondering what exactly happened to Cool Britannia, the nation that seemed to rebound after the recession and slow death of traditional industries of the 70s and 80s that ended the troubles in Northern Ireland, whose prime minister at the time went so far as to pay lip service to joining the euro. No, the idea is not to wax lyrical about Tony Blair, rather to wonder how we got to this, to ask how Britain can see through its current crisis and redefine itself. At this critical hour, what's the plan? Where is the leadership? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at the fact that there is, well, no breakthrough in sight. Joining us, Agnès Poirier, London correspondent for the French news weekly magazine Marianne. Welcome back to the show. Welcome as well to writer and historian Stephen Clark, whose novels include, you brought a copy of it, Merde in Europe, the continuing tales of Paul West, this time in Brussels, right?
Yeah, to find out what really goes on in Brussels, which is a lot less scary than what's going on in London.
Okay, more on that in a moment. Michel de Fabiani, Vice President of the Franco-British Chamber of Commerce. 16 days to go. Are members zen or are they nervous?
They are very calm. They do business. They don't do politics.
Okay. From London, we're joined by Dalia, Gebrial, editor at left-wing news site Novara Media. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. By the way, just to be clear, Tony Blair did not invent Cool Britannia. We can show you a cover of Newsweek magazine that dates back to December of 1996. That was before New Labour had ousted the Conservatives from power, Stephen Clark. I bring this up because it's just such a contrast, that period with what's going on now. Is it the same country?
Well, like 48% is the same. Yeah, I mean, for me, Cool Britannia, it was when the Queen jumped out of that helicopter in 2012. You know, when the Queen walked through Buckingham Palace with James Bond and then appeared in the Olympic Stadium. That was London was the coolest place.
Right, we don't even need to go back that far.
No, it was 2012 then. And then even, it's impossible to believe now, but even David Cameron was cool. Because after the London Olympics, the French were complaining that we'd won the cycling because our wheels went round too fast or something like that. And David Cameron was making fun of them, and even he was cool. And then I think the self-confidence went to his head, and now Britain is about as cool as a bowl of melting ice cream. I mean, it's just gone completely downhill. For me, being a Brit in Paris, we always had this slight feeling of sort of superiority. Historically, I wrote a book called 1,000 Years of Annoying the French. We've been annoying the whole of Europe for 1,000 years and getting away with it. And now suddenly we're shooting ourselves in the foot and all the smugness is just gone. Why? I mean, the problem, I think, is it's the same phenomenon with Donald Trump, which is that it's much easier now to win elections with populist votes, fake news, to influence elections, to target people, to get false messages across about, all this rubbish about how Britain was going to gain £300 million a week by leaving the EU. And apparently, according to Bloomberg, I read this morning on Bloomberg, it's cost Britain about $1 billion a week, just the preparations for Brexit. I mean, this nonsense you can convince people is true now has become so much easier, and there are enough people out there voting without knowing the facts. And if you tell people the facts, they just say, oh, no, they're experts, they don't know what they're talking about, or they're the elites, they don't know what they're talking about. And these days, you can get that message across directly into people's heads through their phones and their computers, and you can convince them, and there are enough of them out there, and they're very motivated, these people, much more motivated than during the referendum. A whole wave of young people didn't vote because they went to Glastonbury Festival or they were watching it on TV. They didn't bother.
Right.
Whereas the racists and all the sorts of xenophobes and traditionalists and people who don't care about Europe, they went and voted because they were motivated.
Dalia, Gebrial, we're 16 days away from when, in theory, Britain is due to leave the European Union, it appears that, well, nobody's opinion has changed much. We're still in this divide. Has anything changed at all since June of 2016?
Well, I think and certainly in the since Theresa May last took the deal to Parliament, we've seen very little change, and we've seen her holding the country hostage essentially to try and push through her vision of Brexit. I think that I would actually disagree with what the previous speaker said. I think that, and also with the concept of Cool Britannia, I think whilst things like the Olympics and all of this put a very shiny exterior on the way that Britain was going, for a lot of working class British people, following deindustrialisation, following the financialisation of the economy, something that was started by Theresa May and continued under Tony Blair, and obviously continued under David Cameron as well. What we've seen is the worsening of the lives of working class people. Now, unfortunately, Brexit has played on the xenophobia and played on latent racism in Britain in order to try and take hold of that crisis and turn it into this kind of disaster movie that we're seeing unfold in front of our very eyes. And it's a shame that leaving the EU on the terms of those like Jacob Rees-Mogg, who want to turn us into essentially a tax haven, will actually worsen a lot of the conditions for the vast majority of people who have suffered from that context that I outlined earlier. In terms of over the past 2 years, the polls don't suggest that there has been any massive shift either way, which is why I think that even though I did vote Remain in the initial election, I don't think that people's vote is really going to solve anything, because there's nothing to suggest that the outcome wouldn't be very similar to how it is today.
Wouldn't be very similar. And Agnès Poirier, we're also seeing this this dichotomy, right? London, where Dalia is speaking from, voted Remain. Places far away from the city centres have oftentimes voted Leave, a bit like what we're experiencing here with the Yellow Vests movement.
And which we are seeing, it's also one of the reasons why Trump was elected. But to go back on what Stephen was saying, I arrived as a student, to Cool Britannia in the mid-90s. And so I would go back, of course, the Olympic Games was a great moment. Also for Britain, it was a great moment of unity and of joy. But
you heard Dalia say it was never cool for working class people.
Well, it was never cool. It's always difficult for working class people. Now, I remember also 18 years as a young kid, even in France, of Britain under Thatcher. It was not a place you wanted to go to, okay? And the mid-90s, Tony Blair arrives in power, and you said in your introduction, we're not going to, wax lyrical and about Tony Blair, but on actually the question of Brexit is speaking so much sense. He's probably one of the very few British politicians, but of course is inaudible because Britain has grown to hate the guy. But it's such a different, I can tell you, I've lived in the UK for the last almost 20 years, and it's such a different country. It was, Tony Blair years were about hope, were about a lot of good measures economically for the working class. Not enough, probably, but it was going in the right direction. And then David Cameron wasn't so cool, but he was young. He was young, and there was this new society, and perhaps he was the acceptable face of a new conservatism.
No, when I say he was cool, he came across well in the media.
Completely.
And the whole concept of Cool Britannia obviously is not covering the whole country. I mean, as Agnès says, working in a factory has never been much fun. But it's true, in the north of England, my family came from the north of England, from Yorkshire. My dad used to work in a valley that was full of mines and power stations. In the 80s, they were demolished. They were piles of bricks. But in the 90s, they were starting to get replaced by service industries. And there was this whole, even if you don't like service industries, okay, if the left, Jeremy Corbyn,
and renewal.
They don't like service industries, but they were giving people jobs, and people had money, they had more hope. And Britain was just a country where, even if you don't like the financial sector, money and investment were flowing in. And some of it doesn't trickle down, but some of it was spreading out and
attracting all the young Europeans. And those young Europeans today are living in London.
Yeah.
And London is such a different town from what it was 20 years ago.
And it was attracting factories as well. I mean, the north of England now, up in the north, they have car factories, which they're going to lose now.
Right.
It was attracting industry as well. So the working class were getting new jobs in industry, which they're now going to lose because of Brexit. It's ridiculous.
1997, the election of Tony Blair is significant because it's when the UK stopped once and for all, Michel de Fabiani, being a land of immigrants. There's now net immigration. If we look at this chart, goes all the way back to the mid-19th century, and you can see it's now a land of immigrants. And well, immigration. The current prime minister is a former Home Secretary. That's been one of the key themes in this whole Brexit debate.
Well, I want to come back to the economic situation of the UK because you had a country which was bankrupt in the 70s, which tried to survive with Thatcher, but which was then in difficulty, I would say, socially. So you had economic bankruptcy, I would say social bankruptcy in a way. And then Blair came with hope and real measures, as you said, effective measures, and the UK has become, whether we like it or not politically, it's a different matter. The UK opinion is one thing, but the reality is that the UK is one of the most important countries in the world, amongst if you accept China, US, etc. But in Europe, you have UK, Germany, France, who are the three big countries. And UK is a very prosperous country. The question of whether the prosperity goes to everybody is not a UK-specific question. It is a generic question. You mentioned France. You can mention every country in Europe has the same problem. But the UK is a success in economic terms, whether you like it or not. And for students, the business schools, the universities are full of international students, not just
But now
European.
you have Dalia Gebrial warning us that with Brexit, that could all change. The UK's selling point could then become that it could just become, a tax haven?
Well,
I think I want to kind of go back on some of the things that have been said. I think we're talking about the Tony Blair years being those of hope, and this idea of it, what I would argue is actually a very surface level of looking at the well-being of a country. Yes, we did it's much worse now under the Conservatives' austerity programmes, but Tony Blair and New Labour in general did not do enough to restructure the economy away from Thatcher's model of financialisation, of neoliberalism, which did not serve the majority of the country. And as well, we mustn't forget that while, of course, the Conservative Party has a much harsher line on immigration, the foundation for that was laid by New Labour, by Tony Blair's government. Detention centres and indefinite detention was introduced by Tony Blair. The scaremongering around asylum seekers and so-called illegal immigrants, this was all perpetuated under Tony Blair as well. So in many ways, New Labour and all of these things that for a lot of us sitting in studios in London and Paris might have visually looked like a good time, was actually for the majority, for the heartlands of the country, and even for immigrants as well, was not actually moving. So while we were sold a dream under Cool Britannia, etc., I don't think that dream came true, as it were. And in terms of Britain doing well economically, Britain is the fifth largest economy in the world, and yet single parents are having to work around the clock to work terrible jobs that do not have adequate work protections, in order to just fund, for example, childcare. All of these social services that have been denigrated and have been slowly starved, starting from Margaret Thatcher, is meaning that even though we're being told our GDP is this, or we're this largest economy in the world, this all feels very abstract to you if you're sitting in Birmingham or in Newcastle and you can't make ends meet. So I would argue that this idea of kind of looking at a time when things maybe felt more hopeful doesn't give us a real analysis of what's happening beneath that hope and beneath
Brexit's
that
going to make it all much worse. Working people are going to lose their jobs. To get back to Brexit,
I completely
Brexit is
agree,
just going
but what I
to
would
finish all our
say
hope.
is that we have to look at the the underlying circumstances of how we got here. And I don't think that the way that we should approach that is to become nostalgic for the period that created those underlying conditions. And one thing that I would say is that this isn't just happening in Britain. Yes, we're looking, it's easy to look at what's happening in Britain and think, wow, things are just going so terribly and it's just the fault of British people who don't know what they're doing. But this is happening everywhere. We have the election of Donald Trump. We have the far right gaining huge amounts of power across Europe. This kind of dissatisfaction with the status quo is sweeping across the world. And unfortunately, at the moment, it is the far right and the right wing that is taking hold of this moment in what
let me bring in Michel Fabiani
famously
on this.
described as disaster capitalism.
Michel de Fabiani, you agree?
Well, first thing I want to say is the political dimension is one thing, the economy, the working condition is another thing. And they cannot be mixed permanently. Otherwise, you make large principles. In the past, the left was for the lower class, the right was for the higher class. I mean, you create a sort of absolute classification, which are wrong today. I think today we're in a world where there is much less differences between people in their way of living. They all want to have the same way of living. And the younger generation, you don't distinguish between a rich or a poor, except that one spends holidays in the Bahamas and the other ones in the countryside. But their behaviors and their mentality is very similar due to social networks. Obviously, there is an impact of social networks on everything. But if you want to have a job, you need to have hard factories or soft offices. But you will never depart from the fact that you need to create activity. Activity is not created by principles or by political people. It is created by measures, social measures, economic measures, tax measures, technical measures, digital legislation, whatever. This will continue. If this stopped, we would be in a disastrous situation.
And do you agree with both Dalia and Stephen that it could get a lot worse after Brexit?
Well, you can see it black or white. You can. Personally, I'm not in politics, so people vote, that's their problem, their decision. They have the vote in their hands. They do what they want with it. We are here as business people. We are here to make business continue, whatever the context. I can tell you one thing. If Brexit happens, very likely, one way or another, the problem will be for the UK to remain economically. So political Brexit is one thing. On the other hand, economic remain is the main thing.
All right, we're going to pick up on that point when we come back. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate. We're speaking in the midst of a week of important votes on Brexit in a divided House of Commons. 16 days to go before Britain is due to exit the European Union. We're talking about it with Agnès Poirier, London correspondent for French news weekly magazine Marianne, historian and writer Stephen Clark, whose novels include Merde in Europe. Which in Merde in Europe, you wrote that in 2016.
Just before the referendum, because I thought it was important to try and tell people what really happens in Brussels, because we were getting so much fake news about what Brussels was doing. You know, British people imagined that, you know, people wanted to make the kilt illegal, and they, you know, seriously, those kind of stories were going into the British press. And so I wrote this novel to find out what was really being done in Brussels. And there's a lot of, I mean, it's true. There's lots of overpaid people there doing not very much except drink, cocktails. But there are people doing things like clean up our beaches, give people good working conditions. And I don't think the Brits really understand what Europe's been doing. Britain is about to find out what Europe was doing in the past and is not going to do any more. That's a scary thing.
Michel de Fabiani is with us as well, Vice President of the Franco-British Chamber of Commerce, which has how many members here?
700 companies.
700 companies.
Most British-linked companies.
And we're also pleased to welcome back Dalia Gebrial, editor at left-wing news site Novara Media. We're looking at these votes which are laying bare not just this dichotomy between growing inequality, the rich and the poor, but also the splintering of traditional parties and the old center-left and center-right blocs having a heck of a time holding it together through all of this. Let's show you a tweet from Tuesday morning by pro-Remain Conservative Member of Parliament, Nick Boles. Nick Boles, who wrote, as Brexiteers tuck into their porridge this morning, they have a very difficult decision to make. I hope they won't mind some frank advice from one who is a colleague to all and a friend to some. Do yourself a favor. Take the win. Vote for the deal. Of course, we know what happened next. It was a 149-vote defeat for Theresa May, whose own Attorney General, Geoffrey Cox, wrong-footed the Prime Minister by reportedly waiting until minutes before that morning cabinet meeting to reveal his skeptical legal advice on her amended divorce deal. And one of May's potential successors as PM, her former Foreign Minister, Boris Johnson, the author of a biography on Winston Churchill, he called on the Commons not to act timorously, but, quote, as a great nation does.
The result is that, like Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, they have sewed an apron of fig leaves that does nothing to conceal the embarrassment and indignity of the UK. And as the Attorney General has confirmed in his admirably honest advice, this backstop doesn't just divide our country in fundamental ways, it ties our hands for the future, and it sets us on a path to a subordinate relationship with the EU.
Agnès Poirier, Boris Johnson, who talks a lot about, well, making Britain great again, about being a great nation. It's always about the stature of Britain when you hear Boris Johnson speak.
Yes, and I don't know if you noticed the images. He was almost alone in an empty Commons. So it's not really a good sign if he is to be the future leader that nobody turns up. Look, and also he's had a haircut. Usually it means something serious is going to happen. Look, I don't think he's going to be the next British Prime Minister. Nobody knows what's going to happen. The truth is, to go back on what your London-based guest was saying, we're not looking back at the Tony Blair years with nostalgia, not at all, but we can just make comparisons. And if we compare the Labour of Jeremy Corbyn today, I mean, it's a disaster because they should be, I mean, Labour today should be ripping everything. They should be in power, really. But Corbyn is a Brexiter. He doesn't want actually a second referendum, unlike most of the people who usually vote for Labour. And we have a Tory party that is in meltdown, you know. And so British people are just pulling their hair because they are so badly represented. And if you look at the polls, let's say there's tomorrow a general election, 44% of the people answering the polls said they don't know who they would vote for. 44%, and that's a rise of 30% in just 6 months, because they don't want Corbyn and they don't want Theresa May or Michael Gove or Boris Johnson. So it's a catastrophe for British friends.
Yeah, and there seems to be a calculation on the part of the Prime Minister, which is that she could be the only option, or at least that's how she seems to see it. She spoke earlier in the Commons and talked about the threats of a snap election or a second Brexit referendum.
We will continue to work to deliver leaving of the European Union, but to deliver leaving the European Union with a good deal. And as regards the right honourable gentleman, he doesn't agree with government policy. He doesn't even agree with Labour Party policy. He has nothing to offer this country.
Dalia Gebrial, why isn't Jeremy Corbyn 20 points ahead in the polls?
So I would draw everyone's attention back to the last election, the snap election that Theresa May called. And I think that what we're seeing with the Jeremy Corbyn situation is that when Jeremy Corbyn is given platforms in the British media in the way that Theresa May or any other kind of leader of the opposition would have, when he is able to present his vision for Britain, for example, in the 2017 manifesto, that is very, very popular. Jeremy Corbyn was considered to be on, almost dead when the last snap election happened. We thought that there was going to be 100 seats that Labour was going to lose to the Tories. But actually, the ideas represented in Corbyn's vision for Britain, which is very moderate, is very centrist when you look away from Westminster and look to the actual country. His vision around workers' rights, his visions around environmental protections, around housing in particular. These all are bang in the middle of what the country wants.
But the pressing issue right now is Brexit.
I do agree that the situation around Brexit for both parties is incredibly difficult because both parties are, I agree, not really fit to govern in the sense that they both have this massive split between the, parliamentary Conservative Party, the parliamentary Labour Party, and the membership. So I do agree that that is an issue, and I think that what we're seeing is a renegotiation of the poles around which people organise politically, which happens every few decades.
For the first time,
it's part of the organic shifting of politics.
But for the first time I can ever remember, for the first time I can ever remember in my life, at the moment there is no leadership in politics in Britain. Before, I disliked Margaret Thatcher. She destroyed everything that, all the factories where my family was working and stuff. I hate it, but there's no leadership anymore. The function of Jeremy Corbyn should be to lead the opposition. He's agreeing. It's the first time I've ever known a leader of the opposition who agrees with the government or doesn't express his opposition.
Corbyn put
Hang on, just a second. Wait a minute. And there's no leadership.
Agrees on Brexit.
Yeah, he's not contradicting. He's been silent. He's not leading the opposition. He's just sitting there quietly, hoping that that Theresa May is going to fall. There's no leadership in the Tory party because all the Conservative Party is just waiting for her to fall and so they can step in. And all we've got now, it seems to me, now the only leadership we have now is a sort of the equivalent of the captain of the Titanic saying, "Don't worry. It's not an iceberg, it's a huge mound of ice cream. Let's just go towards it and we'll have ice cream forever and ever." And don't listen to the people who are saying it's dangerous because they're just scaremongers. Don't listen to them. And you've just got these politicians repeating the same nonsense over and over again, or even worse, not saying anything, as Jeremy Corbyn is doing. And so we're just trundling towards this iceberg. And no one is able to do anything. And as a Brit, and I'm not a politician at all, just as a Brit watching this, for me it's a tragedy. It's the first time I can ever remember seeing the whole of the Houses of Parliament, except a few principled people, and there are very few of them, standing up actually saying what they think. The rest are all just hiding behind a smokescreen. Theresa May was.
I would absolutely disagree that Jeremy Corbyn
was campaigning to remain before she became Prime Minister, and now she's working for Brexit. For me, it's just a bunch of incompetent hypocrites. And as a pure Brit, I wouldn't know how to vote. Now there's nobody there. There's nobody with showing any real principle. That's the trouble. There's no principle. There's no honesty.
The idea that Jeremy Corbyn is not putting forward a vision for Brexit is to completely ignore everything that the
That's
Labour
not the job
Party
of a leader of the opposition.
saying.
The job of the opposition is to contradict everything the government is saying on principle and to put forward the contrary. He's not doing that. He's sitting there waiting.
The leadership of the opposition is to provide a vision that reflects the principles of its membership. And that could viably unite the party.
But no one knows what their principles are on Brexit.
One of the reasons why, they do. The reason we don't know what their principles are on Brexit is because we're constantly talking about, for example, a few weeks ago, we were spending days and days on end talking about a book that was released on Jeremy Corbyn that accused him of lying about shaving his beard when he was in Jamaica. Do you remember when we?
You're talking about that now. We want to talk about Brexit. We want to talk about Brexit, not Jeremy Corbyn's beard.
Jeremy Corbyn has had the same vision for Brexit, which is to remain in the customs union, to remain in the single market, and to protect workers' rights and environmental protections in a way that ensures that those protections are maintained.
He
vision
voted
he's had
against
throughout.
joining the European
And
Union in 1975. He still seems to be against
and Jeremy Corbyn,
being in the EU.
Jeremy Corbyn, like a lot of people in Britain, has a critique of the EU. But what he is proposing is a kind of soft Brexit that enables us to still participate in the majority of the EU's activities, but whilst also still retaining the ability to make some decisions outside of the EU as well, particularly when it comes to workers' rights and environmental protections. That's the vision he lays out. That's a vision that I think can actually...
But you're explaining it a lot more clearly than he does, quite frankly.
This is what I am getting from just watching, from actually investigating and seeing for myself, because what we're seeing
Why doesn't he say it then? Why does he leave it to you to say it rather than standing up and saying it in the House of Commons?
The reason they do. Jeremy Corbyn, John McDonnell, Diane Abbott, all of these people articulate this. But the problem is we're so focused on demonising Jeremy Corbyn and people who voted for Jeremy Corbyn as an individual that we're not even hearing the things that he's saying incredibly clearly over and over again.
Michel de Fabiani.
Yeah. As I said initially, the political opinions are very diverse. The political leaders, if there are any, are very different. The business needs to continue. I think the key point is the business, which is the industry, the services, tourism, etc., needs to continue. That's necessary for the UK, it's necessary for Europe, it's necessary for every country.
Okay, so let's talk practically about this. 16 days to go.
Yes.
What should there be a delay? Should there be a delay?
Well, whether there is a delay doesn't matter very much, because if there is a delay, it will be very short anyway.
Because some are talking inside of the Commission now, or the Times of London's reporting that some are considering a one-year delay, in fact.
Well, that would be difficult with the election. They would need to agree that there is no election, no European election. So otherwise, it doesn't mean anything. No, what I want to say is this thing. I can understand that the politicians want the UK to stay with Europe, but not within Europe. Okay, fine. For business, doesn't matter too much. What we want as business corporations who work with the UK, from the UK to the continent, don't forget that there are 90 billion pounds exchanges between, exchanges between France and UK, just between those two countries. And it will need to continue. Otherwise, if we start to stop investing in the UK, or the UK stopping investing in Europe, it will not be good. We want to continue.
Last week, Michel de Fabiani, we saw work slowdowns at the French ports. We saw them here at the Gare du Nord. Customs officials complaining, saying we don't have the manpower. Should there be a no-deal Brexit on March 29th?
This is not a very fundamental. It's a very short.
You're not too worried.
It's a short-term issue. If you put twice more time, more people, twice more system, it will work. It may not work on day one, but it will work within days or weeks. The French government has confirmed it will work. The British government has confirmed. The administration will not be silly. What you have seen recently is perhaps an exacerbation just to show. But the reality will be that there will be lots of possibilities. The problem is not the very short-term issue. The problem is, do we want to continue to invest in a 65 million people market? And will the UK want to continue to invest in France, Germany, Netherlands, Spain, or whatever? Or do we prefer to go outside Europe, look at China, India, Nigeria, Kenya, whatever? Or do we want to continue to work together within or not the EU political circle?
And what do your members think? How are they planning? What are they preparing?
Some have already announced that if it is too difficult, they will look at investment elsewhere. It's obvious. We always, as a company, we always look at the investment where it is worth making it. And if it's less interesting in the UK next year, people will reconsider. But they will always think that it is a big market in itself. And don't forget that the UK can be considered as an entry market for the former Commonwealth countries. If you invest in the UK, if you have a distributor in the UK, it allows you to enter easily the former Commonwealth, which is difficult if you are French, Dutch, or Spanish. In the same way, the French offer to the UK industry and services an entry in the former Francophone Africa. That's a reciprocity. Except that the Commonwealth is more than 2 billion people. Francophone Africa is 300 or 400 million people.
It brings us back. We've come full circle here. We've gone back to the question, Agnès Poirier, of what is Great Britain and its status.
Well, I find you quite optimistic. I'm sure they would love you in the UK. Look, perhaps we can talk about the extension, because this is what in all likeliness, there are going to be a majority tonight against a no deal.
Which means there'll then be a vote on Thursday for an extension.
But it doesn't mean anything if there's no alternative. So this will be taking place tomorrow. And if they are voting for an extension, how long? So perhaps 2 months, because some of the Brexiters say they want a no deal. They just want another 2 months to actually prepare practically for this. But of course, it means different things to different people within the Commons, because some want an extension to actually perhaps have a second referendum. Or, as Philip Hammond said this afternoon, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the Minister for the Economy, can we actually have a cross-party compromise and go towards a softer Brexit? But it means that Theresa May then is in difficulty.
And why weren't there those cross-party negotiations in 2016?
Well, exactly. And why did she trigger Article 50 2 years ago? Because now they are between a rock and a hard place. And also, the other thing, it's not because they are voting for an extension of Article 50 that it will be granted by the 27 states. And we've heard in the last 48 hours that Aaron Banks, one of the millionaires who financed the Brexit Leave campaign, was in the Veneto region to meet with his friend Matteo Salvini. What for? So that Italy can veto the extension that might be asked tomorrow by the British government. In that case, it's no deal straight away.
Stephen Clark, I'm haunted a little bit by something that Michel de Fabiani said earlier. He said, if there's a Brexit, he's still not certain there's going to be a Brexit. Are you certain there's going to be a Brexit?
That, for me, is the problem and the tragedy, is that for the last almost 3 years now, the British Parliament has done nothing except talk about Brexit and try to sort of lessen the catastrophe or whatever. They're doing nothing for the country. All they're doing is manoeuvring about to try and stay in power. And I looked at what Philip Hammond was saying this afternoon, and his whole statement, first of all, his whole budget statement, spring statement, is based on conjecture. He doesn't. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, the Minister of Finance, does not know what's going to happen in his country in 2 weeks' time. That's never happened before, except maybe in 1940. That's never happened before. And also, the only two measures he had that were not to do with Brexit. One was they were giving a bit of money to combat knife crime, of which there's an epidemic in the UK, but they were giving a tiny bit of money which doesn't even cover the cuts in police budget there have been over the past year. And the second one is they're going to put free sanitary towels into schools for young girls. I mean, those are the only two, which is great for teenage girls, but there is the only two non-Brexit measures in a Chancellor of the Exchequer's financial statement. They're not running the country at all. They're just talking about Brexit, which ultimately comes down to a power struggle within Britain. Who's going to be the next Prime Minister? Who's going to be in power? That's all they're really interested in. For me, as a total cynic, they're not managing the country.
So the probability or the possibility of the country sleepwalking into a no-deal Brexit in 16 days' time.
Nobody knows. Nobody knows. That's the thing. Nobody knows what is going to be happening in Britain in 2 weeks' time. How can you run a country? I mean, they're not running the country. I mean, this is the tragedy. They just don't know what they're doing because they can't know what they're doing.
But there is a lot of preparation, let's be honest. There is a lot of preparation on the European side and in the UK, on the visa, on the students. For instance, the Erasmus program will continue for at least 3 years, which is important because students can. And there is a lot of preparation on documents, on automatic scanning of trucks and cars and all that stuff.
And companies are leaving Britain in case there's no more investment. They're prepared. They're pulling out of Britain in case of things go wrong.
Some companies, a few big names have done that. Honda, for instance, have announced their next factory will not be in
Prepare prepare for the worst and hope for the best. Dalia Gebrial, I want to thank you so much for joining us from London. I want to thank Stephen Clark, Michel de Fabiani, Agnès Poirier. Stay with us. Media Watch is next. And we say hello to James Creedon.
Hi, Francois.
Boy, those front pages of the British papers were
I suppose
brutal.
they had a fair amount of, material to work with.
With or without Brexit, we'll always have the tabloids.
That's right. At least there's British humour to kind of temper it all. The Times, driven to despair, and there's Theresa May being driven somewhere. So, and certainly to despair, I think. This is the Daily Mail, the House of Fools. Are they in a position to talk? I'm not sure, but anyway, that's the Daily Mail's perspective.
Editor, remember?
Oh, right, true.
So it's less...
Right, yeah, a little bit less radical. House of Fools, the Sun, they didn't headline on the Parliament of Pygmies, but they did mention it. So you have the House of Fools and the Parliament of Pygmies, which is probably not very fair on Pygmies, because I don't think they did anything to be introduced into the whole thing. Croaky Horror Show, reference to Rocky Horror Show, and Theresa May's voice or lack thereof. So that's the Sun's front page. How much more of this can Britain take, says the Daily Express. I mean, it is funny because a lot of the press did kind of foment a lot of Brexit. The Sun, we already had that. Now, the Scotsman in Scotland have been, they had this particular piece on Nicola Sturgeon, First Minister of Scotland. I will exercise mandate to hold independence referendum, she said today, but not until we're through the tunnel, so to speak, when it comes to the chaotic negotiations, until they're concluded. So it all looks a little bit like it's not going to resolve itself very quickly.
And there's cartoons to go with the headlines.
That's right, channeling a similar degree of despair. That's Theresa May there playing or not playing correctly croquet with the little spider dangling there in the croquet goal. I don't know, could you call it that? This is a cartoonist... Paul Thomas, I believe. At last, the country is united. Nobody knows what will happen next. And that's somebody looking at the Commons debate from last night. May's deal defeated by 149. Another cartoon here by the Belgian cartoonist Pierre Kroll. And you can see here a voter hesitating back in June 2016, dithering, unsure which way to go. It could be catastrophic. What should I do? And the reassuring voices of, I think it's Boris Johnson and...
Nigel Farage, by the looks of it.
Possibly, yes, with a clown nose, I think, saying it's also simple, just vote leave, it'll be fine. What else do we have? We have this cartoon by German cartoonist Bengen, Harm Bengen, Brexit, and can we turn off the life support is the translation of that there, life support for Brexit dead in the water. And this, what else do we have? This is Have I Got News For You, satirical show, because of course we tend to forget that the Labour Party is also getting a lot of criticism too for not, for being not adopting the Remain position. A lot of people, I think, are frustrated by that. After Theresa May loses her voice again, the Labour Party sends condolences as they lost theirs permanently in September 2015.
So Stephen Clark got in a James Bond illusion. How about the Beatles, since we're talking about
all right, Beatles, they're being channeled into tweets. You say yes. I mean, I think this has happened before. You say yes, I say no. You say stop, I say go, go, go. Oh no, you say goodbye, etc. You see, anyway, I think the lyrics tend to sum up how some people feel Brexit is going or not. Submarine, yellow submarine. We all live in a Brexit submarine, and I suppose that's an allusion to the sinking feeling that some people have for a whole range of reasons. I suppose economic reasons would be just one. And speaking of Yorkshire tea, because of course businesses, exports, whatever, affected. Dear rest of the world, sorry for pretending to be a grown-up all these years. We've actually just been three toddlers in a trench coat the whole time. Lots of love from the UK. So there is a degree of humour coming through, but I suppose it's dark humour to say the least. Then obviously lots of discussion of the technicalities, the decisions. I mean, I said I wouldn't show too many of those tweets because it's probably repetitive. Every MP who voted for Article 50 notification, this is a contributing editor to the Financial Times, and every pundit who cheered and clapped this Brexit is on you. What is happening now is a direct consequence of what happened then, allowing May to trigger a process with a hard deadline, but without preparation or a clue. So people feeling maybe this was an inevitable outcome. This is Donald Tusk's Instagram, and he received a letter from an English girl called Sophie, and she said, I live in Britain, I know we are leaving the EU, but I think we should be friends. Please message me please may I have a signed photo of you for my Europe book. And she drew him a unicorn, which is definitely very cute, but a little bit sad as well. So yeah, I'll finish on that note because I suppose it's optimistic-ish.
The unicorn.
Yes.
Maybe a unicorn will save us.
Why not?
James Green, many thanks. I want to thank. So we've got now a unicorn. I want to thank our panel once again. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.